I can't believe this. This is too much.
Denise took everything Rachel had spent 8 years building. Her money. Her business. The one friendship she trusted more than her own family. Then, 3 years later, a letter arrived at Rachel's door, and what Rachel did next made her own family ask if she had lost her mind. By the end of this story, you might find yourself asking the exact same question. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you, and do not forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Rachel Turner grew up in a small town outside Asheville, North Carolina, in a house 2 doors down from a girl named Denise Callahan. They were 7 years old the first time they met, standing on opposite sides of a chain-link fence that separated their 2 backyards, arguing over whose turn it was to use a rope swing that technically belonged to neither of them. By the time they were teenagers, nobody in that town could picture one of them without picturing the other standing right beside her. They rode the same school bus for 11 years. They shared the same locker in the 8th grade after Rachel's combination lock broke and the school never got around to replacing it. They worked the same summer job at a roadside ice cream stand the year they both turned 16, splitting tips down to the last coin even when one of them had clearly worked a slower shift than the other. When they were both 26 years old, sitting in Rachel's kitchen one evening with a pot of coffee between them, they did something most childhood friends only ever talk about doing over drinks and never actually do. They decided to open a bakery together. Denise had spent 3 years working under a pastry chef in Charlotte, learning things she said she wanted to bring home. Rachel had spent those same years working the books for a local accounting firm, learning the parts of running a business that Denise had no patience for. Between the two of them, they had almost enough saved to make it work, and what they were missing, Rachel's father agreed to co-sign, on the condition, he said half joking and half serious, that they never let a man come between the two of them the way he had seen happen to other friendships in that town. They named the bakery after Rachel's grandmother, a woman named Opal who had taught both girls to bake bread when they were small enough to need a step stool to reach the counter. For 8 years, that bakery on Maple Street was the center of both of their lives. They arrived before the sun came up, Rachel usually first, unlocking the front door in the dark and turning on the ovens before Denise arrived 20 minutes later carrying whatever new recipe she had been testing in her own kitchen the night before. They split every single cost down to the penny, kept one shared business account between the two of them, and trusted each other in a way that only two people who have known each other their entire lives ever really can. Regular customers used to joke that Rachel and Denise finished each other's sentences behind the counter, that you could not ask one of them a question about the business without the other one answering first, often before the first woman had even opened her mouth. There was a regular named Harold Briggs who came in every single morning for 8 years and ordered the same thing, a plain bagel and black coffee, and who used to tell people around town that watching Rachel and Denise run that bakery was like watching two people share one single heartbeat. There was a woman named Constance Ferris who held her daughter's engagement party in the small dining area behind the counter, because she said no other bakery in the county understood her family the way Rachel and Denise did. For 8 years, nothing about that friendship gave a single person in that town a reason to worry about anything at all. Then, in the final year, something started to shift, quietly enough that almost nobody noticed it happening in real time. Denise started looking thinner. At first it was barely noticeable, the kind of thing only someone who saw her every single day would catch it all. She waved it off as stress, then as a stomach bug she could not seem to shake, and eventually she stopped answering the question about her health altogether, changing the subject so smoothly that Rachel did not even register the redirection until much later, looking back on it from a distance of years rather than days. There were phone calls Denise started taking outside, standing in the alley behind the shop with her back to the door, her voice dropped low enough that Rachel could never quite make out the words no matter how close she stood to the propped open door. There was a piece of mail Rachel once saw her folding quickly and shoving into her coat pocket, the kind of small, quick motion that looks like absolutely nothing in the moment it happens, and only becomes significant when a person is forced to look back on it later, searching every memory for a sign they missed. There was an afternoon Denise left the shop for what she said would be 20 minutes and did not return for nearly 3 hours, offering no real explanation when she finally walked back through the door, and Rachel, exhausted from covering both of their jobs at once, was too tired that day to push for one. At the time, none of it seemed like enough to stop and ask a real question about. Rachel has said since that if she had known what she was looking for, she might have seen the whole thing coming from a mile away. But she did not know what she was looking for, so in the moment, she simply did not see any of it at all. Denise was tired. Denise was stressed. Denise had always run a little hot and cold, ever since they were teenagers, and Rachel had spent 20 years learning not to read too much into her friends' quiet stretches. That pattern, so familiar and so harmless for 2 decades, was the exact reason nobody noticed anything was different this time until it was already far too late to ask. On a Tuesday morning in October, Rachel arrived at the bakery before 6 in the morning, the same way she had nearly every single day for 8 years, and found the front door already unlocked before she had even touched her own key. For a moment she assumed Denise had simply beaten her there for once, and she almost called out a greeting before she stepped fully inside. The ovens were cold. The display cases sat completely empty, wiped down and bare in a way that told Rachel this had not happened in a rush. The register, which should have held the entire previous night's earnings, held nothing at all. On the counter sat one folded note, written in handwriting Rachel would have recognized anywhere in the world. It read only, "I am sorry, I had to," and nothing else. Rachel called Denise's phone 11 times before noon that day. Every single call went straight to voicemail without a single ring. She called Denise's mother, who sounded just as confused and frightened as Rachel felt, and who said she had not heard from her daughter in nearly a week, which was unusual enough on its own to worry her even before Rachel explained why she was calling. By that same afternoon, Rachel learned from the bank that the shared business account the two of them had built together for 8 years had been drained down to almost nothing, emptied out over the course of several small withdrawals stretched across the previous 2 weeks, careful and quiet enough that neither the bank nor Rachel had noticed the pattern while it was happening. For a long time after that morning, Rachel believed exactly what anyone standing in her shoes would have believed. She believed her closest friend since childhood had planned the entire thing, had waited for the right moment, and had ultimately decided that everything the two of them had spent 8 years building together was worth less to her than whatever she needed that money for instead. Rachel told the bank everything she knew. She told the landlord, a man named Wallace Pruitt who had known both women since they signed their very first lease and who seemed almost as stunned by the news as Rachel was. She told the small handful of suppliers who kept calling about unpaid invoices for a business that, as far as anyone could tell, no longer existed in any meaningful sense. Word travels fast in a town that size, and within a matter of weeks, half of Maple Street had constructed its own theory about where Denise Callahan had gone and why she had done what she did. Some said she had run off with a man nobody in town had ever actually met, a theory that gained traction after someone claimed to have seen an unfamiliar car parked outside her apartment more than once in the final months. Others said she had always been the reckless one of the two of them, the one who acted first and thought later, and that this had only ever been a matter of time. A cousin of Denise's, a woman named Priscilla, told anyone who would listen that she had always sensed something was wrong, though she could never say exactly what she meant by that when pressed for details. Nobody's theory came anywhere close to the actual truth, and for 2 full years, Rachel did not know that truth either. Rebuilding a life from nearly nothing is not something that happens quickly, and it is most certainly not something that happens gracefully. Rachel lost the lease within 2 months of that morning, unable to cover rent on a business bringing in no income at all. She sold her car, a modest sedan she had owned for 6 years, to cover what remained of the outstanding supplier debt, walking everywhere or borrowing rides for the better part of a year afterward. She took a job working the overnight shift at a diner off the interstate, a place called the Wayside, coming home every single morning smelling like grease and burnt coffee, showering just to feel like herself again before collapsing into sleep as the rest of the world was only just beginning to wake up around her. She moved into a small 1-bedroom apartment above a laundromat on the edge of town, because it was the only place within her budget, and on the hardest nights, the low, steady hum of the industrial dryers below her floor was the only sound that helped her fall asleep at all. She stopped answering questions about Denise altogether, because every version of that story ended exactly the same way, with her oldest friend disappearing and taking everything she had built along with her. She stopped going to the small handful of places in town where she knew she might run into someone who wanted to talk about it, avoiding the grocery store on Saturday mornings, skipping the church her family had attended for 3 generations for the better part of a year, simply because she could not bear one more sympathetic conversation about a wound that refused to close. 2 years passed like that, slowly, one overnight shift at a time. Rachel climbed back towards something that resembled stability, though it never quite felt the same as the life she had built before. She worked 2 jobs for the better part of a year, picking up extra shifts wherever she could find them. She saved money in small, careful amounts, rebuilding a savings account one modest deposit at a time. She told herself, more nights than she could count, that she had finally let go of the anger, even on the nights she knew, somewhere underneath the exhaustion, that this was not fully true. She started baking again eventually, though only at home and only for herself, small batches of bread that nobody but Rachel ever tasted, made in a kitchen far smaller than the one she had once shared with her closest friend. Her mother said once that she thought it was a good sign, Rachel returning to the thing she loved even in this smaller, quieter form. Rachel never told her mother how many of those loaves she ended up throwing away untouched, unable to shake the memory of exactly whose kitchen she had learned to make them in. Then, on an otherwise unremarkable Thursday afternoon in the third year, an envelope arrived at Rachel's apartment with no return address at all, written in handwriting she recognized before she had even fully opened the mailbox, the same small, slanted handwriting from the note left behind on that bakery counter 2 years earlier. Rachel stood at the mailbox for a long moment before she could make herself carry the envelope upstairs. She sat with it unopened on her kitchen table for almost an hour before she finally found the nerve to read a single word of it. The letter was from Denise. It did not ask Rachel for forgiveness, and it did not offer a single excuse for what she had done. Instead, it explained, in Denise's own words, that she had been diagnosed with a serious illness that very same month everything fell apart, a diagnosis she had kept from everyone, including her own mother, because she said she could not bear to become the thing everyone worried about. She wrote that she had drained their shared account not to disappear with a stranger, as half the town had assumed, but to pay for a surgery she had no other way of affording and was far too ashamed to explain to the one person who had built an entire life alongside her. She wrote that she had spent every single day since convinced Rachel would be better off believing she was simply cruel and selfish than knowing the full truth, because cruelty, at least, did not require Rachel to sit there and watch her get sick, the way she had once watched her own father decline for 2 long years before he passed. She wrote about the surgery itself only briefly, saying only that it had gone well, and that she had spent the 2 years since recovering slowly, moving in with a distant relative 2 hours away because she could no longer afford her own apartment and had nowhere else left to turn. The letter ended with a single address, and one line that Rachel says she has never once forgotten since. "You do not owe me anything," it read. "I only wanted you to know." Rachel sat with that letter for 3 full days before she made a decision that surprised nearly everyone who thought they knew her story by that point. She thought about the empty register and the cold ovens. She thought about the overnight shifts at the wayside, the sold car, an entire year spent falling asleep to the low hum of industrial dryers below her floor. She thought about the small, careful loaves of bread she had thrown away, unable to eat them. She thought about how easy it would have been to do absolutely nothing at all, to fold that letter back up, place it in a drawer, and let the silence between them become its own quiet, permanent form of punishment, because sometimes the cruelest thing one person can do to someone who hurt them is simply never answer at all. Instead, on the 4th day, Rachel got into the car she had bought second-hand only the previous year, and drove 2 hours to the address written at the very bottom of that letter. The house Rachel found at the end of that drive was small, set back from a quiet county road, with paint peeling at the corners and a porch light that no longer worked. Rachel sat in her car outside that house for nearly 10 minutes before she made herself walk up to the front door. Denise opened it thinner than Rachel remembered her being even during the worst weeks at the bakery, her eyes carrying the particular kind of exhaustion that only comes from fighting something alone for a very long time. One first afternoon, working slowly through 2 years neither of them had shared with the other, Denise explaining the surgery in more detail than the letter had allowed, Rachel explaining the diner, the sold car, the loaves of bread she could never bring herself to eat. Neither woman apologized in any dramatic way that afternoon. There was no single moment where either of them broke down crying, no scene that would have made for a satisfying ending if this had been a story written for the screen instead of a life actually lived. There was only 2 women, sitting in a small kitchen, slowly relearning how to be in the same room with each other again. Over the following months, Rachel visited Denise more than anyone, including Rachel herself, ever expected her to. She drove the 2 hours out to that small house nearly every other weekend, at first telling herself she was only checking in out of habit, and later admitting to her mother that she looked forward to those drives more than she wanted to explain. She drove Denise to a handful of follow-up appointments when there was nobody else available to do it, sitting in waiting rooms with old magazines, exactly the way she once sat behind a bakery counter waiting for bread to finish rising. She never once brought up the money again, not directly, though there were nights driving home when she found herself doing the math anyway, out of old habit more than resentment. Slowly, without either woman ever announcing it out loud, an old debt between them quietly closed itself for good, not through any single conversation, but through months of small, ordinary moments that gradually outweighed the one terrible morning that had once defined their entire friendship. People who knew Rachel's story would later ask her why she had not simply let Denise face the consequences of what she had done entirely alone, why she had not taken the one clean opportunity most people only ever dream of getting, the chance to watch the person who wronged her struggle without lifting a single finger to help. Harold Briggs, the man who used to order a plain bagel and black coffee every morning for 8 years, asked her almost exactly that question one afternoon when their paths crossed at the grocery store, unable to hide his genuine confusion about how Rachel could simply move past something so significant. Rachel never had one tidy answer for that question, not for Harold, and not for anyone else who asked it in the years that followed. All she could ever say was that revenge would have given her one sharp, satisfying moment, followed by an emptiness that would have stretched on long after that single moment passed, an emptiness she suspects would have outlasted whatever brief satisfaction the moment itself provided. Kindness gave Rachel something slower, and far harder to put into words for people who had never lived through anything similar themselves. It gave her the quiet sense that she had never allowed someone else's worst decision to decide the shape of her own heart, that whatever Denise had done, it would not be the thing that determined who Rachel herself eventually became. She chose it, she says now, not because it was easy, because revenge would have been so much easier, so much simpler, so much more satisfying in the short, immediate sense that most people mean when they talk about getting even. She chose kindness instead because she wanted, more than she wanted to be right, more than she wanted an apology or an explanation or any of the things she once believed she was owed, to still recognize the person staring back at her in the mirror once it was all finally over. Rachel and Denise eventually opened a second, much smaller bakery together, 3 years after that first letter arrived, in a modest storefront 2 towns over from where the original one had stood. They did not name it after Rachel's grandmother this time. They named it, simply, Second Chance, a name Denise suggested and Rachel agreed to without a single moment of hesitation. It is smaller than the original ever was, and it will likely never grow into the business the first one became over 8 years. Rachel says that is exactly the point. Some things, she says, are not meant to be rebuilt exactly as they were. They are only meant to be rebuilt honestly. If you were standing on that porch in Rachel's place, 2 years of hurt behind you and the woman who cost you everything on the other side of that door, we want to know honestly, would you have walked inside, or would you have turned around and driven straight home? Tell us in the comments below, and if this story moved you, stay close, because the next story we have for you is one you will not want to miss.